Hi, you're listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education. Matt, how are you today? So great to be back.
Yeah, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. So, Matt, I was thinking back to a conversation we had a while ago where I was asking you for some advice on keeping up with contacts and networks, different people I've networked with and some strategies. And I remember you giving me some great advice, which I'll share in a moment. But I thought today we could talk about our best networking advice and advice for keeping up with those we run into professionally.
Sure. I'm curious to hear my advice that I gave you. I'm glad to know. I'll be glad to hear it again. Well, what do I do now? I work in advancement and development, and that's a lot of keeping just touch with people. You need to show you're invested. You need to check in with how they're doing. A text message right now is kind of my go-to. Although I've found during COVID, particularly phone calls tend to be longer. I just think it's, part of the times we're in, whereas before, you're always running somewhere. Now it's like, well, yeah, I got a minute to talk. So that's always good. Other ways I'll keep in touch professionally, outside of fundraising are just hey, I had this thought. What do you think about it? Kind of a text that I'll send. So I did that the other day. I was like, hey, you've always got good ideas about this. What do you think of this problem? Things like that are just open-ended questions are fun. And you get to glean from other people's wisdom. And I like to think that, I love it when people send me stuff like that, right? Because I get to, not show off in a flex kind of a way, but you get to talk about what you do and it's fun to, be able to help out. So, that wasn't a very coherent answer. So I'm going to go with texting right now and good old traditional phone calls. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's great advice, especially in the times we're in. So the thing that I've been trying since we talked, I think it was actually a year ago, I've been trying to keep it going. It's a goal of mine. Is I was asking you for some advice on keeping up with folks, and you mentioned just dropping them a note periodically. And I'm a huge astronomy nerd. I'm not super knowledgeable about it, but I enjoy astronomy. So I bought a giant box of I guess like postcards that are blank on one side. And now I challenge myself to send notes to, a few people a month that just pop into my head and send them out. And I think that's been pretty good. I'm not doing it with any sort of agenda, but just to stay connected with people, which can be difficult when you're super busy. And I think it's been relatively successful. I appreciate that advice.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, I do that too. Both professionally and personally. A box of note cards is just totally worth the investment. And who doesn't love getting something in the mail that's not a bill,
Right.
It's just like a little treat now. Anyway.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us about our guest today, Matt?
I sure will. Our guest today is Scott Sikes. He has over 30 years of experience with nonprofit organizations. He has broad experience in frontline fundraising and leadership, including positions as elected chairman of the Council of Vice President of External Affairs for the University System of Georgia, Vice President for Development and Community Relations at Shepherd Center, the nation's largest spinal cord and brain injury hospital, Vice President for University Advancement at Valdosta State University, Interim Executive Director of Development at University of Georgia, where he was also Director of Principal Gifts, Major Gifts, and Planned Giving, and he has years of experience on various nonprofit boards. He was a founding member of the Georgia Planned Giving Council in 1988, later served as president, and he was co-founder and president of the Athens Estate Planning Network. Scott is a certified fundraising executive, fellow of the Association for Healthcare Philanthropy, and a certified financial planner. Let's listen in on our conversation with Scott Sikes. Hi, Scott. Welcome to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
Hi, great to be with you guys today.
Oh, we're so glad you're here. We would love for you to just give our listeners a basic overview of your career journey and tell us a little bit about what you do with Columns Fundraising.
Okay, great, Matt. Thanks. Quickly, I have worked in all aspects of the development world and all aspects of what might be the broader advancement world. Fortunately, and I never set out to do any of that stuff. I was a Russian language major in undergraduate school and actually then went to college in the former Soviet Union. And somewhere along the line, I had also been interested in the securities world and finance. And I got out of college and went to work for a securities company. And while there, people at the University of Georgia knew that I worked with Charitable Remainder Trust and things like that. And so they literally out of the blue offered me this job to be their director of planned giving. And then I, from there, worked in planned giving and major gifts and principal gifts and prospect research, corporate and foundation relations, and actually keeping of records. And at a major university that's 200 years old, you literally have records that go back hundreds of years of paper records. And I was involved with digitizing all of those records and then and archiving records, and then also was involved in the changeover of two different database systems. So that's a little bit about the higher education sort of sphere. And I eventually became vice president for all of external affairs at another university, Valdosta State University. It's about a 12,000 student university in the university system of Georgia. And I headed their foundation, and then I was also head of their communications and alumni relations and development, the full sphere of the external relations or so-called advancement world. And then was recruited to come to a hospital in Atlanta, the world's largest brain injury and spinal cord injury rehabilitation hospital is in Atlanta, called the Shepherd Center. And I came and worked there for nearly a decade. And then with three friends launched a consulting firm, something we'd been talking about doing for 20 plus years, almost 30 years with one of them. And with me, we kept saying we were going to do this. And so we launched the consulting firm. Then we bought another consulting firm and merged that with ours. And now we're 20 odd people, 20, that's quote unquote odd people working currently in 20 states, doing consulting with fantastic. All types of nonprofits, purposefully no niche. There's no niche in independent schools, no niche in healthcare, no niche in higher education. We try to do the waterfront.
That's fantastic. Before we go on to the next one, I would just love to know a little bit more. You said you went to college in the former Soviet Union. Tell us a little more about that. We've got to know about that.
It was one of the greatest experiences in my life. It was both terrible and wonderful, all rolled into one. And we would do a whole podcast, I think, on that alone.
Yeah, I bet.
But the short version of the story is that it was an interesting time because we were at really, truly the height of the Cold War in about 1980, 81. And it was a totally closed society by and large. People struggled to try to listen to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and things like that on shortwave. Wow. That the Americans and other Western Europeans were broadcasting. And it's at the time, it was sort of dangerous to be a foreigner and be there. And it was also very safe at the same time. So a police state is very safe if the police don't currently want you. So,
right.
It's just so different than it is today. there.
Yeah.
It's a dramatically different country, and I've been back many, many times since then, and it's almost unrecognizable now. My old dormitory is now a high-end European hotel.
That's fantastic. Well, that was a side trail, but one worth taking, because that's just a fascinating story. You've had a fascinating career.
All right. So Scott, today we're talking about advancement, development, and fundraising. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, can you connect the dots for us just a little bit? Your background is mostly in higher education. How is fundraising at the college level similar or different to fundraising for independent schools or even nonprofits?
That is a great question. It's one that I talk about doing my favorite thing in this industry, which is board member coaching. We like to say that we coach board members. We don't train them. You train your dog, but you coach people. And one of the very first things we talk about with them is that fundraising is fundraising is fundraising. And in fact, we'd rather they be doing development and or advancement. And we'll talk about that and maybe in a second question about the difference between maybe fundraising and development and advancement. But it's all the same. If you're at a synagogue, if you're at a Catholic church, if you're at a Protestant church, if you are at a human services organization like you're preventing blindness, or you're at a health organization fighting multiple sclerosis, if you're Penn State University, if you're any independent school all over the country, small to prestigious, the fundraising is really the same by and large. There are nuances in healthcare fundraising, there are nuances in independent schools, nuances maybe in higher ed, et cetera, but they're tiny nuances, and they're such a small statistical differentiator maybe that it's almost not worth worrying about. So for the purposes of today's podcast, we'll just say that fundraising is fundraising, and you still have to be focused on individuals primarily. And then you need to be focused on, of course, foundations secondarily. And then after that, corporations. And we might talk about that later too, about who actually gives money and why.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk about kind of the basic overview and framework. But I want to hit on what you said about understanding the difference between advancement, development, and fundraising, because sometimes those are used and it seems just like they're interchangeable terms, but there are differences. How do you define those terms?
I'll tell you my definition based on doing this for 30 plus years. And my definition really comes mostly from a group called the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, CASE, C-A-S-E. And those of us who belong to it for a long time love to call it copy and steal everything. We go there and we share ideas. We share ideas freely with one another, and then we copy the good ones. But the idea of the Council for Advancement and Support of Education is that it's composed of people that work in alumni relations, and they work in communications, publications, public relations. They work in governmental relations. They work in traditional development area, the fundraising area, and more. And in the independent school world, it's very, very similar. In independent school world, many people call the development function advancement, but advancement is really the broader field that entails the public relations, the marketing, the communications, maybe governmental relations, which need to be done even by independent schools. Particularly in a smaller town, you need to have a seat at the table.
Right.
Because if you don't have a seat at the table, you might be on the table being served. So I think that the differentiation between fundraising and development is that fundraising is basically, I'm going to say, okay, Michael, okay, Matt, I want to ask you for a gift tonight of $10,000. That's basically fundraising. Development is where I've met you 3, 4, 5 times. I've done something with you. I've maybe helped you in some form or fashion somewhere along the course of a year or 2 years. And that help might be, maybe I helped connect you to someone else in your same field, maybe someone who became a business associate or a friend or whatever. And then at the right point, I have the right person ask you the right way for the right amount. for the right project that really resonates with you. And that's more of the development world.
So we've got advancement, which is a broader spectrum, might include communications, might include, as you said, government relations, a variety of capacities, public relations, I think is what, marketing, right. Yeah. Development is drilling down into the longer processes of fundraising, and fundraising is more the operation. What other aspects of the fundraising mechanisms are good to know about in an educational institution? You mentioned alumni relations. What other constituencies are there?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the independent school, that's where it gets a little bit niche-y, a little different than other areas. Independent schools, by and large, the donors are going to be alumni, and they may be non-alumni matriculates. Let's say, like one of my business partners attended a private school, didn't graduate from there, but he still has a warm place in his heart for it. His family moved across country or whatever, and so he left that school. Then he graduated from a public school, but so he was a matriculate, not an alumnus. And so there are the alumni, there are the matriculates, then there are the parents of the students and the grandparents of the students. And then occasionally there are those locally community-spirited citizens who want to support a really good program, maybe, or provide scholarships for the underserved sort of community. And of course, that's on a lot of folks' minds now at independent schools. And a lot of people are today talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what some friends of mine are talking about now is that diversity and inclusion are strategies, and equity is the desired outcome. And so I'm seeing more and more of this sort of non-alumnus, non-alumna person in the community who might provide scholarship funds to add an underserved sort of community student at the school.
Okay, so still kind of building out a framework here. Let's get real basic. Why does the school need to raise money? Shouldn't tuition be able to cover the costs?
That's a question that is asked at lots of different nonprofits, and I would say that fundraising, the way I look at it, is to provide a margin of excellence. This icing on the top, maybe, of the budget that really is where the rubber meets the road. Let's say that the cake here is paid for by tuition and fees by the students and their parents. And the fundraising maybe is a nice thick layer of icing on the top that makes everything a little bit better. And of course, the real truth is that at some institutions, fundraising is a large measure of the amount of money in the budget each year. And budgets, and for those who are listening to the podcast that haven't had much experience with independent school budget, the budgets are very different at different independent schools, but the budget could be composed partially of proceeds that are spendable from an endowment, and that's investments that the principal has never touched, but capital gains and dividends maybe, and interest may be spent each year, and those might form a portion of the pie. If the budget were a pie, let's say maybe 10, 20, 30% could be from endowment, and maybe 10, 20, 30% could be from new fundraising coming in. The endowment, of course, was old fundraising a long time ago. So then there's the new fundraising. And then next, of course, are the tuition or matriculation, as some places might still call it, and or fees that need to be paid. And then there are also different sponsorships that come into play, particularly on the athletic side. There usually are local corporate sponsorships of different athletic programs. And that's a little different than fundraising per se.
I'm going to go a little bit off script here and ask, so what can you give us an outline of the difference between what we often hear about as annual giving versus a capital campaign, or, a school is building a new gym? How is giving to that money, giving to that project different than giving to the annual fund? And why do those two different pots exist?
I would say that annual giving we can think of as asking everybody every year for a gift that meets their family budget or their philanthropic priorities. Let's say that the typical annual gift might float somewhere around in the difference between what someone spends on their home utilities bills and maybe their home mortgage. So let's just call that somewhere in the $100 to $1,000 range, just roughly. This is so different across the country. And in a city like we're here in Atlanta, where we're rich off the charts, it's hard to compare. But let's just call that someone maybe gives $100 to $1,000 every year is the annual giving that they do. And of course, everybody's different. There's always the one person who gives $300,000 a year, and that's their annual gift. Major gifts are usually defined in the mind of the development staff and the advancement staff. They're usually defined by a size. But the donor usually defines the major gift by what it means to her or to him. And the major gift is usually in the donor's mind something that's really big and something that they're only going to do every so often to maybe a couple of times in their life, perhaps. So one of the things that we struggle with in talking to some client organizations is to get them out of the mindset of what they and their staff think and to try to be donor-centric and think like the donor is thinking about the donor's own gift. So in a nutshell, I would say that many people consider at their nonprofit organization, like an independent school, they would consider a gift that's, say, $10,000, $25,000, $50,000 or more to be a major gift and the sort of thing that someone does every so often. Now, a capital campaign gift would usually be someone who's making a special gift for an item of capital, and capital would be either bricks and mortar, new construction, bricks and mortar renovation, or maybe it might be something like an endowment fund or a new science laboratory project of some kind, a new STEM lab or something like that, or maybe something for the school orchestra. So capital campaign gifts are usually like the accounting term of capital. It's something that is going to be depreciated over 5-7 years or more. And maybe the person makes in payments for as much as 5 to 7 years. And oftentimes that gift is going to be one of their ultimate gifts, if not their ultimate gift, which is where we then segue over into the world of sort of deferred gifts and what's called planned giving.
That is great advice about defining the size of the gift by the donor's perception of the size of it, how it fits into their own personal giving history. I'm guilty of making that like dollar line mark mistake, shooting for that instead of thinking through, well, what does this mean to them? Where does it fall into their philanthropy? Anyway, so can you give us a basic outline of the different roles within, I said here on our question list, advancement team, but I'm actually going to ask you to drill that down to just development office. Okay. So just amongst the fundraisers, so to speak, who might work in a development office?
Well, one of the most important people is whoever opens up the checks in the mail, because one of the things we need to talk about tonight is the terrible, terrible fallacy that everything is done online. I'm sitting here surrounded by my Apple devices and all my electronic devices, and I'm a techno person. My brother's an IT director, so we have it in the blood.
Oh yeah,
But the truth is, most gifts that are substantial, they still come in as a check or a credit card or a stock gift to an independent school. And so we need someone to open the checks, deposit the checks, do the accounting, the data entry. And one of the key things that we all struggle with at every nonprofit is creating a database and maintaining a database. And it's really critical because the longer the organization is around, the more it can begin to mine that data and do a really good job in communicating with the existing donors in maintaining them, hanging on to them. I'll give you just one quick example of that. And I've digressed here, I know, for a minute, but I got an email tonight to my email address that said, happy birthday. Well, it was my wife's birthday. My wife always makes gifts to this organization, not me. They had somehow just automatically sent out an email that didn't have my wife's name on it. It just had my email address and said happy birthday. So bad database work. So that's one of the first key things, is getting the money in, getting it deposited, getting it organized, whatever, thanking the people, and receipting the people. So these are all functions that usually fall within donor services, it might be called, or it might be called all sorts of other things, but it's often seen as part of the annual giving function, the folks who are trying to ask people year in and year out, and maybe all through the year, to make gifts to the organization. So annual giving, firstly. Secondly, traditionally, major gifts. And oftentimes we use sort of a sales term where we want to convert, quote unquote, people from annual donors to major donors. And then, of course, there's a planned giving function. And then there typically is a corporate and foundation relations function. And then there are various and sundry other functions. If an organization is old and large, it might have someone who is a principal gifts or a transformational gifts or something like that officer. And that's something I did for a couple of years. I was the principal gifts officer for the University of Georgia. And that meant that I was the person who dealt with the people who were most apt to maybe give 6- and 7-figure current outright gifts that year.
Excellent description of the office. Sometime I'll have to tell you about a solicitation I got from an unnamed university. It was not University of Georgia, that I did not attend. It was pretty funny.
Oh,
I don't know how they found me.
I wanted to mention to Michael and Matt here, before I forget, if you'll indulge me for a second, I mentioned that one of the huge incorrect notions that floats around in people's head is, and they're nice people, they're good people, but they believe that the ice bucket challenge is the way to raise money. And they believe that social media is going to be a way to raise money. Yeah. And they believe that e-blasts are a way to raise money, and text to give is a way to raise money. And the truth is, all of those things can be helpful and they can be supportive, but there's great research that was done again and again the past 3 or 4 years by some people who are digital marketers. And they really set out to prove that the world had changed, and the glaciers had melted and all of that, and the world was totally different and everything was going digital. Well, what they came to find out is that year in and year out, still 45% of all donors are age 65 and up, and they're still making gifts by stock and check, and occasionally credit card. 72% of all donors are age 55 and up, and they're still making the gifts by stock and by cash and by check and credit card. And the other interesting fact is the Association of Fundraising Professionals has studied this year in and year out and sliced and diced it. And so 76% of all donors to all charities 76% of all donors to all charities came from only 4% of their donors, and those gifts were $5,000 and above. Two other statistics, sampling the same group of charities, so these numbers won't add up to 100 because we're going to triple sample the same group. So first we had 76% given by 4%, and those were all 5,000. So the next group is 89% of all the gifts to all charities were given by 14% of the donors, and those gifts were all 1,000 and up. And then finally, 96% of all gifts were given by only 33% of the donors, and those gifts were $250 and up. And so all of the emphasis on digital giving, text to give, peer-to-peer campaigns, social media fundraising campaigns have all been on the under $250 space. and it just doesn't even move the needle. It doesn't even make the needle quiver on the analog speedometer, that we're talking about here. So it's really a critical thing for people to know who aren't in fundraising as well as those who are in fundraising, because people on boards or people who are faculty members or staff members at independent school might say to the development office, why aren't we doing more special events? Why aren't we doing peer-to-peer giving? Why aren't we doing text to give? Why aren't we doing more social media fundraisers? They just don't raise any money. However, what they do is they help, quote unquote, prime the pump. In the old days when you had to pump water by hand with a hand crank, you would first have to put some water into the pump to get water then to come out of the pump. So the social media and all those other things can be excellent pump primers. And what we counsel people on now is layering that in with a mailing campaign, a phoning campaign, a text to give, an emailing campaign, social media, et cetera.
And for those of you who are listening, I work in the advancement field as well, and I can say I've made that same mistake. I've tried peer-to-peer fundraising and tried a lot of those digital methods, thinking they'd be more efficient. There's also a higher cost too, because there's 100,000 startups out there that are wanting to sell you a product that's going to help you do peer-to-peer fundraising, and the data just isn't there. What you just got from Scott is worth gold, right there, people.
And the funny thing is this is the same way it's going to be for probably 20 more years or so. That's the thing, that even if we focus all of our time and attention on people who are under 30, it's going to take 20 years for them to have the money to be able to really give, because people really need to be 55-ish to be able to really make the larger gifts that really impact the organization. And that's just the facts. It's not a value statement or a value judgment or anything like that.
Right. Yeah.
So Scott, what are some common misconceptions about the fundraising side of the shop amongst teachers and administrators who don't have as close of a relationship with that side of the school?
I think that teachers and administrators that aren't in the fundraising sphere really need to be brought into it at some point, because I believe that the best fundraising or development is very donor-centric. And the donors want to know the other administrators, they want to know the other teachers, and they would like to maybe be called upon, let's say during the pandemic here, with video calls or just good old-fashioned audio phone calls, and of course post-pandemic in person, by maybe the development officer and one of those folks, a faculty member and administrator. And there is a lady whose name escapes me right now who taught me this in Florida about 20 years ago. I was at a conference on healthcare fundraising, and she talked about there are really three kinds of people that could be in the world of the donor or working with the donor. They could be a connector, a maven, and a solicitor. And the connector, of course, is just the kind of people who love to network and introduce people to one another. The maven is the person who has all of the technical knowledge about a subject. And of course, this is the perfect place to bring in the faculty member or the administrator who's not in the fundraising world. And then, of course, the solicitor could be the fundraiser person themselves, the development officer, the advancement officer themselves. So out of those three, the connector, the maven, and the solicitor, one person could play all three roles. The three roles could be played by two people. But I think that that's one way for teachers and administrators to be involved. But what they do need to know is that their staff are out there working at the headmasters and or the boards or the head of school. Every school has a different name. The principal, it's called in some places, so different across the country. They're working at the head of school's direction in the development office. They can't do program du jour that a different faculty member is interested in raising support for. The faculty member may have the greatest program imaginable, another administrator may have a great program, but the development staff, the advancement staff has to do what is in the strategic plan put forth by the head and by the board. But I think that Another key thing maybe for those folks to know that aren't out in the business, so to speak, is that fundraising is virtually never about taxes. I do a series of seminars now. I've done about 4 of these now, and I do this with my friend and colleague, Pete Taccone. Pete's sort of a god in the planned giving world, having done this for 40 years. And we call this thing we call it the tax guy who became the psychology guy. So I started out on the field as a tax expert, and I was calculating discounted present values of remainder beneficiary interest and charitable remainder uni trusts that were net income plus makeup and all of this sort of arcane stuff. And I thought that was all really cool, and I liked math. But the real truth is what I came to learn over the course of the last 30 plus years is that the donor was always driven by a desire to support the mission of the organization, and the donor was virtually always responding to an ask by someone that she or he respected, connected to the organization. So I would say, in a nutshell, it ain't about taxes.
That's really good advice. That's great to know. And someone from, as someone who doesn't work on the advancement side, I would say that's definitely a pretty common misconception. So thanks for clearing that up. You mentioned the importance of, the role, I guess, of a maven, that donors want to engage with, someone who's on the ground working with students. What advice would you have for someone who's recently been promoted into a division head position or some other new administration position, who now is being asked to come to meetings with donors and maybe rub elbows with some of the top donors? What advice would you give them? What are some do's and don'ts in that scenario?
This is something I actually teach classes in also, which is funny that you brought this up, because a lot of the time I talk about within my firm what we call quote unquote grandma's rules. And that is some simple things like say yes, sir, and no, ma'am, and some of those things which have fallen out of fashion in lots of circles. Don't put your feet on the person's desk, post-pandemic when we go out and visit. Don't smoke in their office and then put your cigarette out in their piece of china that's on their desk that was a collectible and you thought it was an ashtray. I say that because that's an actual real story from some years ago. Not of me, not of mine. But I would say that we still need to do those things which were once considered sort of courtly, which is standing up when someone enters the room, if we're in person, and shaking hands post-pandemic, if we can ever do that again, looking people in the eye. And I would say that most people need to, in the advancement world and development world, don't get straight around to business unless you know that's the person, that's what the donor wants to do. Most donors want to engage in at least brief chit chat about learning about you and before they get right to business. And I see too many development officers and advancement officers who go straight into saying, well, I came here to tell you about the new campaign. Let me tell you how great it is or whatever. And they first need to ask a few open-ended questions and get to know the person. And I would say we could do a whole podcast on open-ended questions, all the things you can ask. And as I said, I've been doing this for decades, and it's amazing how 99%, 98% of people will tell you their entire life story and be thrilled to tell you if you will just go in and ask open-ended questions. Those are not yes/no questions. You would say, tell me about how you got the idea to start this business. How did you start this business? Where did you start this business? Where did you get the funding to start this business? You can there are a million ways to do things. How did you meet your spouse, partner, significant other? These things can segue eventually into questions like, do you plan to give to your children equally or equitably? At some point, if you have established a relationship, maybe a year in, you're actually really talking with someone about really deep issues with them. And so the big advice to wrap up this point from me, I think, is treat people and like you would want to be treated. And that usually involves getting to know them and making them feel special. And I will say one more thing about this is that it took me a long time to learn that I should ask them questions about them before telling them how wonderful I was. And I say that with a smile and a laugh because I'm sure that many young people, they will be nervous on a visit and they would just launch into saying something about their own background as opposed to first questioning that other person. And something that Dale Carnegie wrote about in the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, many, many years ago, is you could go to an event, meet someone, ask them questions about themselves. They would never know anything at all about you. They would leave and go tell someone else. And they'll say, I just met the most interesting person. And they know nothing about you, but you were interesting to them because you asked them lots of questions. And that hasn't changed in decades.
Oh, thank you for that advice. That's wonderful. All right, let's look ahead a little bit. What do you see as the funding or fundraising challenges that schools are going to face in the near future?
I think we're facing a lot of the same challenges we've always faced. There seems to be more and more and more competition from more nonprofits. Of course, there are more and more people every day, and more money is being created through enterprise, through commerce. But I think there's more and more competition and more sophisticated nonprofits out there working. And I think that no one can rest on their laurels. No one can just assume, well, we've always gotten a gift from Mrs. Smith or Mr. Johnson or Ms. Jones or whatever. They're going to have to keep working for that and stay on top of their game. So I think that might be something out there. I think that we're going to continue for the next year or two at least seeing lots of talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode here about my colleagues and friends and I are seeing diversity and inclusion as strategies and equity is the outcome. And for the independent school, I think we're going to want to provide more opportunities for folks who might be in an underserved community to participate in all that we have to offer. Other than that, I think that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And we need to just keep doing the good work that we're doing.
Scott, you mentioned earlier that each industry has some small nuance to it. I'm curious, and maybe it's just the things you just highlighted, but do you see any trends in philanthropy specifically in educational institutions that you might be aware of?
I can't think of anything there, Michael. That is another fantastic question. You two have really done your homework on this to prepare, I think. You reminded me, however, of one thing that I forgot to mention about people who are heads of school or department heads or maybe a new faculty member. At larger institutions, larger independent schools, the head and some department heads may spend as much as one day a week out of the office visiting people, let's say pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, who might be donors. And I failed to mention that earlier. That's one of the things that if other staff members or faculty members on campus see the advancement staff gone or the head gone from campus, they should applaud that and know that that's where they should be. They shouldn't say, why aren't you ever in the office? In point of fact, it should be just the opposite. If they ever see the head on campus, they should go, what are you doing here? You're not helping us out at all. So I wanted to be sure that I mentioned that in tonight's conversation.
So for those who don't work in the advancement office and are, just going about the business of school, as we're coming out of COVID, what are some things that they should be aware of in the fundraising side? And you just mentioned some challenges and some opportunities, but are there things that just teachers and principals and admissions folks should just be aware of in the fundraising world that they don't, that they don't connect with very often?
Yeah, I think that we're going to be engaged in the pandemic for a long time still. When it first started, I thought, 3 months and we'll be through some of the worst of this. I spent a good bit of time reading about the Spanish flu, the Spanish influenza pandemic of 100 and some years ago, and it really lasted about 3 years altogether, depending on which source you read. So I think we're going to be in this for a good bit of time. And I think one thing that faculty members need to think about is that I've actually seen an independent school shut down its entire fundraising operation, which was insane. And they thought it was inappropriate to ask people for money during the pandemic. And I believe that it's still appropriate to ask people for money during the pandemic, and we do not need to think for the donor. We need to let the donor decide what for him or for her is a priority. She may think this is a priority. He may think this is a priority, giving to your school. And we don't have to be tone deaf to all the things going on around us in the world, but we need to keep talking about the education of children is going to go on and young people. And we all need to be about that really important business. I'm trying to think of what is the motto of this Phi Kappa Phi. I think let the love of learning light mankind or something like that. And I think we all need to be focused that way and don't assume that we should stop fundraising for our cause and just raise money for healthcare. In fact, the people that we are graduating may become great researchers. One of the huge problems right now in higher education are people who can't have the hands-on graduate student experience due to the pandemic that they could have before, where they are integrally working with other researchers close by each other in the lab. And we may be missing out on future discoveries because we weren't as focused on education and doing education in the same way. So let's be donor-centric and let the donors decide.
I think that's a really compelling argument. I definitely think investing in education is an investment in our future, for sure.
Well, you work now as a consultant and you have a fantastic consulting firm. Tell us what role should and could a consultant play in fundraising at a school?
I think there are two ways consultants can work. Consultants can actually do fishing for you. I'll use the old fishing metaphor. Consultants could fish for you, but I prefer to be the consultant who teaches you how to fish. So I think that my preferred role is in coaching the board and coaching the senior administrators and coaching the senior faculty on how to do a better job at what they are doing. And I think they can then execute it in a much more appropriate and personal way. And my job is really, in some respects, to sort of add zeros to the work they're already from a dollars and cents standpoint, to help them add zeros to what they're already doing. I actually do for some organizations occasionally, and different people in my firm occasionally actually do the fishing. For example, we can completely outsource someone's grant writing to our 8+ grant writers and full-time grant editor to write grant proposals and letters of inquiry and things like what we call LOIs, letters of inquiry. We can completely do all that for people, but the real sweet spot for us is really helping boards and those senior leaders transform their organization, and just by doing small things and doing them in a strategic way.
That's fantastic. I love the illustration of teaching them to fish and coaching boards as opposed to training boards. That's also good. I suspect the boards probably respond a little bit better to that as well. To that
well, the thing is, they typically love it. One of the things that I'm doing next week with a board of an educational organization, I'm currently working with 3 different independent schools, and one organization that I'm working with in about a week, we're doing a physically distant, I like to say physically distant, not socially distant. We're doing a physically distant in-person training where we're all spaced more than 6 feet apart in a room that has more than 30-foot high ceilings. And we're going to be doing some solicitation role play because they're at the point where they're ready to begin doing some solicitations themselves, of course, coordinated with their advancement staff, their development staff. And it's an awful lot of fun. So I have people like a table for 10, and I'll have 4 people seated at that. And of course, they have masks on, but they're sort of pretending we're post-pandemic, and we're pretending that one group is a donor couple. And sometimes the couple is maybe a parent and an adult child in the role play. And then the other couple is a solicitor and a maven, or one of them is the connector and the solicitor, and the other is the maven of the information. And they will each have a little script to go by for the people who are the pretend donors, and the pretend solicitors don't know what type of person they're going to get. And we have nice people, and we have mean people, and we have people that want to chat all day, and we have people who are very brusque and things of that nature. And it's really a lot of fun. And the board members usually come to that saying, "Oh my God, I don't want to be a thespian today." And they wind up, they love it. And they want to stay and do more. So I'm really looking forward to that.
The role of role playing and simulations in education is really fascinating to me right now. The medical field has been doing simulations and role playing as a part of training for a really long time. And there's really great research coming out of different graduate schools of education right now about a really intentional attempt to push simulations and role playing into educational leadership programs. And it seems to be showing some promise, but I would think advancement would definitely be one of those areas where getting practice, actually doing it, makes a huge difference.
Well, let's look at athletics, for example, just as a metaphor. I'm not an athletic person. I'm my mother's great disappointment. I was good at reading. My mother was a big athlete in her junior high and high school. So back when we had what was called a junior high and a high school in the old days. Anyway, so she was the captain of every sports team there was, and then there was me who could read. So anyway,
nice.
What we found out in athletics, if we just study it briefly, is that most athletes spend virtually all of their year practicing for maybe a few minutes of actual, we'll call it court time or field time. So hours and hours and days of practice for a few minutes of the real thing. Why don't we do that in the advancement world and in other fields? Why don't we practice more before we go do it? We even practice in the, I'm a foreign language person. We practice in the foreign language world. We will do years of study and drills and whatnot in practice before we actually go in country somewhere and try to use that we've learned.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think the book has been recommended to death, but the book Grit by Angela Duckworth, she talks a whole lot about intentional practice and how it's different from just the everyday idea we have of practice. It really speaks to the point you're making right now.
Michael, that reminds me, there is a really old book that was, I think, the sort of breakthrough book on visualization. And this was by a guy named, I believe, Maxwell Maltz. And the book was Psycho-Cybernetics. It's a really old book. I mean, decades old. And he was a guy who was a plastic surgeon. And he realized that people who had been in a terrible accident had low self-esteem because of the way they looked or whatever. And this led him into this somehow, and I'm not a scholar of him or anything, but this led him somehow into studying visualization. So he'd have a basketball team stand and shoot baskets from the free throw line, for hours. Then he'd have another group sit in a room and visualize themselves throwing the ball through the basket. The free throw line. Well, you can guess what happened. The people who spent all the time visualizing when they actually were on the court did better than the people who actually had been shooting the baskets. And there was something about that being intentional about their focused mental effort, maybe, like you brought up.
That's fascinating.
We kind of glossed over it, but I think this one's important to know. So I'm going to ask you a very leading question, Scott. When we talk about the different sources of revenue, and I don't necessarily mean constituencies, but, is the bulk of funding that is philanthropic, is that coming from grants? Is it coming from booster clubs? Is it coming from individuals? How does the breakdown of typical philanthropic funding go for an educational institution?
The breakdown of giving across all charities is basically 68 to 69% from individuals, plus 9 to 10% from bequests, which would be gifts from individuals in their wills, trust, estate plans in some way. So that would be 78, 79% of all giving. Then somewhere on the order of 16, 17, 18%, depending on the calendar year, comes from the general category of foundations. One half of that 16, 17, 18% typically comes from family foundations.
Right.
And then the other half are those who are foundations where all the family members have died and it's become more of an institutional sort of situation at that point. Finally, only about 5% come from corporations. And the 5% from corporations is flat year in and year out for years. It has just never really changed. And what's happened, interestingly, in the past couple of years is that giving between individuals and foundations seems to fluctuate back and forth by about 1%. And it's usually caused by skewness in the statistics. One huge gift from one family can skew those results. These are the ones you see announced in the Wall Street Journal. Family gives $100 million to wherever, and those one gifts maybe so they create a new foundation with $1 billion or something like that, and that will skew those figures. But otherwise, it's been pretty well the same for years and years and years. One interesting trend is that giving to religion and all the things related to religious things have been decreasing at an increasing rate for decades now. At the same time, the giving to education and to other charitable enterprises has been slightly increasing. There's not really a limited pie. I don't want to say that there's a limited pie, but if you looked at it that way as a pie chart, year in and year out, the giving has been leaving religion and going to education and healthcare and the environment and whatnot.
Yeah, and as you said, there's family foundations. That's not like the Goizueta Family Foundation or the Woodruff family. That's the Scott Sikes Family Foundation.
Right.
Scott Sikes, and it gives to things that Scott Sikes knows and loves.
Right.
So it really is like dealing with an individual more than anything else.
Exactly.
I loved your illustration.
I was going to say that's the main thrust of my point is that individuals.
Yep.
That's what you have to focus on.
Right.
And your board will often say, "Oh, let's write grants. If we write grants, we'll raise lots. Let's write Oprah Winfrey, and let's write Tyler Perry. We're here in Atlanta, home of Tyler Perry, and he's just a wonderful guy. But we don't need to write him because we need to talk to the people.
He's probably not interested in your school.
Yeah. He's already doing lots of other things. So,
yeah, and as you said too, in terms of the pie, my understanding, as far as individual fundraising, the pie is getting larger every year. Is that
every year? And the only correlation that we see is never to tax law or tax policy. The correlation we see year in and year out is to the Standard & Poor's 500 index, basically the sort of the middle of the road stock market indices. And giving usually is a lag behind that of approximately a year. And that's just because the stock market was at an all-time high December 31st here of 2020, amazingly. And that's going to mean a really great fundraising year this year.
Well, Scott, this has been a delightful and extremely informative conversation. We really appreciate you being on the podcast. I've learned a whole lot. We ask all our guests the same 3 questions at the close of our show. What should people be reading? What should people be listening to? And how can people connect with you?
Oh, I'll do the last one first. I'm at Scott H. Sikes, Sikes on LinkedIn. And I am at my firm's website, columnsfundraising.com, all one word, columnsfundraising.com. I don't know about what people should be reading right now other than their local business publications. But I can tell you that some of the things I read, I'm very eclectic as a reader. And this year I've been reading the socialist progressives of the late 1800s, like looking backward 2000 to 1887 by Edward Bellamy. And it's a sort of a socialist utopian story. And then I've been reading Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged, totally the opposite end of the spectrum. And it's basically all about the rugged individual and how one person can do great things. And so it's an example of my eclectic reading. And there's so much great stuff out there. I think that one can never catch up with it all, it seems. But this year we've had so much in politics about socialism or not socialism or capitalism and all this sort of thing. I thought, well, I'll read some of the seminal works on those subjects.
Well, Scott, it has been fantastic talking with you today. We will put links to the ways to connect with you in our show notes. And just thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you too, Michael, Matt. Really enjoyed it and hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you for listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.